My neighbor cut down my trees, so I turned his backyard into a public park. You think you know your neighbors until they destroy something irreplaceable on your property. When Mike discovered his century-old oak trees had been cut down while he was away on vacation, he assumed it was a mistake. But when he found out his HOA president neighbor had ordered the removal, claiming the trees were unsightly, Mike realized this wasn't about landscaping. This was about control. What the HOA president didn't know was that Mike had been quietly researching property records for months, and what he found would turn their quiet suburban street upside down forever. Mike Chen had spent 30 years working as a city planner, dreaming of the day he could retire to his grandfather's old property in Willowbrook Estates. The 2-acre lot wasn't just any piece of land. It held for generations of family history, including 3 massive oak trees that had stood there since the 1800s. His grandfather had built the modest farmhouse in 1942, and Mike had spent countless childhood summers climbing those very trees. When Mike finally moved in 2 years ago, Willowbrook had transformed from a quiet rural area into an upscale suburban development. The HOA had formed 5 years earlier, bringing strict rules about lawn maintenance, fence heights, and architectural harmony. Most longtime residents like Mike were grandfathered in, meaning their existing properties didn't have to conform to the new standards immediately. Mike's house was simple compared to the McMansions surrounding it, but he loved every weathered board. More importantly, he cherished those oak trees. They provided shade for his entire backyard, housed families of squirrels and birds, and represented the last piece of the area's natural history. He'd even hired an arborist who confirmed the trees were healthy and could stand for another century. His next-door neighbor, Brad Morrison, had different ideas. As the newly elected HOA president, Brad lived in a 6,000-square-foot colonial that he'd built right up to the property line. Brad constantly complained that Mike's outdated house brought down property values, but what really bothered him were those trees. Their massive canopy cast shadows over Brad's pristine lawn and pool area for several hours each afternoon. Brad had approached Mike multiple times about trimming back the trees, offering to pay for the work. Mike politely declined each time, explaining that the trees were protected under the county's Heritage Tree Ordinance. Besides, they were clearly on his property. Mike had even had a survey done when he inherited the land. The HOA meetings grew tense whenever Mike attended. Brad would make pointed comments about certain properties that didn't match the community vision. Other board members, mostly Brad's golf buddies who'd moved to Willowbrook in the last 3 years, would nod in agreement. Mike noticed how they'd approved expensive landscaping projects for Brad's friends while nitpicking every small change Mike made to his property. Mike's wife Sarah had passed away the previous year, and tending to the property had become his way of honoring her memory. She'd loved sitting under those oaks, reading in the dappled sunlight. The trees weren't just landscaping to Mike. They were living monuments to his family's legacy. What Mike didn't share with his neighbors was his professional background in municipal planning and zoning law. During his career, he'd seen countless property disputes, HOA overreach cases, and boundary conflicts. He knew exactly how these situations could escalate, and he'd quietly begun researching the legal history of Willowbrook Estates. Something felt off about the development's paperwork. The original land grants didn't match the current property descriptions, and there were gaps in the chain of ownership that made Mike's planner instincts tingle. He'd spent evenings at the county recorder's office, pulling dusty files and cross-referencing surveys that went back decades. The more he dug, the more inconsistencies he found. Property boundaries that didn't align, environmental easements that seemed to have been forgotten, development permits that referenced land parcels that no longer existed on current maps. Mike kept meticulous notes, building a timeline of how Willowbrook Estates had evolved from farmland to subdivision. As summer approached and Brad's complaints about the shade intensified, Mike sensed trouble brewing. During the last HOA meeting, Brad had made a veiled threat about taking action regarding properties that didn't maintain community standards. The way he'd looked directly at Mike while saying it left no doubt about his intentions. Mike began photographing everything. The trees, their exact location relative to property markers, their healthy condition, the wildlife that depended on them. His planner's training told him to document everything before conflicts escalated. What he didn't realize was just how far Brad was willing to go to get what he wanted. But then things got worse than Mike could have imagined. Mike had been planning his 2-week visit to see his daughter in California for months. Sarah had always wanted to visit their granddaughter's new school, and Mike was finally making that trip in her memory. Before leaving, he'd hired a house sitter, his retired teacher friend Janet, to water plants and keep an eye on things. The night before his departure, Brad appeared at Mike's front door with a clipboard and his signature fake smile. "Just wanted to give you this official notice about your trees," Brad announced, handing over an HOA violation letter. The document claimed Mike's oak trees violated the community's aesthetic standards and created a safety hazard due to falling branches. Mike read the letter twice, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Brad, these trees are protected by county ordinance. They're heritage trees. They can't be removed without special permits." Actually, Brad replied smugly, "Our HOA covenants supersede county regulations for aesthetic issues. You have 30 days to address the violation or face daily fines of $500. Mike kept his voice calm despite his rising anger. "I'll be reviewing this with my attorney when I return from vacation. These trees stay." Brad's smile didn't waver. "Well, you better make it quick. The 30-day clock starts tomorrow, whether you're here or not." The first week in California went smoothly. Mike enjoyed time with his daughter and granddaughter, though he couldn't shake his worrying about the HOA situation. Janet texted daily updates. Everything was fine, the house was secure, and she was enjoying the shade while reading in the backyard. Then came the phone call that shattered Mike's peace. "Mike, I'm so sorry." Janet's voice was shaking. "I was out getting groceries for 2 hours, and when I came back, the trees are gone. All of them." Mike's phone nearly slipped from his hands. "What do you mean gone?" "There's a tree removal crew here with a HOA work order. They said they had authorization to remove hazardous trees while you were away." "Mike, they cut them down to stumps. All 3 of them." The tree removal company, Morton's Tree Service, showed Janet official paperwork signed by Brad Morrison as HOA president, authorizing emergency tree removal due to imminent safety concerns. The crew chief explained they'd been told the homeowner had agreed to the removal but couldn't be present due to a family emergency. Mike's hands shook as he called Brad's number. Voicemail. He tried the HOA management company, closed for the weekend. He called Morton's Tree Service directly. "Sir, we had proper authorization from your HOA president," the company owner explained. "The work order stated the trees posed an immediate danger and needed emergency removal. We followed all protocols. Did anyone verify I had agreed to this?" The HOA president assured us all homeowners had been notified. "Look, we're sorry if there was a miscommunication, but we can't put the trees back." Mike spent the next hour on the phone with his attorney back home, learning the crushing truth. Emergency tree removal was within the HOA's power if they claimed immediate safety concerns. Even though the trees had been healthy, proving that after they were already cut down would be nearly impossible. The financial blow was staggering. The arborist had valued the 3 heritage oaks at over $40,000 each for replacement. If century-old trees could even be found and transplanted, the environmental impact report would cost another $5,000. But the emotional devastation was worse than any dollar amount. When Mike returned to Willowbrook 3 days early, he stood in his backyard staring at 3 massive stumps surrounded by sawdust and wood chips. 40 years of childhood memories erased, Sarah's favorite reading spot destroyed. The wildlife habitat that had thrived in those branches, gone forever. Janet met him at the back door, tears in her eyes. I tried to stop them. Mike, I called the police. But they said it was a civil matter since the HOA had paperwork. That evening, Mike received an email from Brad with the subject line property improvement complete. The message was brief. Hope you're satisfied with the enhanced sunlight in your yard. As you can see, the HOA is committed to maintaining community standards. Looking forward to seeing your landscaping improvement plan. The arrogance of that email ignited something cold and calculating in Mike's chest. Brad thought he'd won. He thought he could bully a grieving widower into submission with fraudulent paperwork and intimidation tactics. But Brad had made one crucial mistake in his rush to remove the trees. In his arrogance, he'd never bothered to check the actual property boundaries, and Mike's months of research into Willowbrook's development history were about to pay off in ways Brad could never imagine. What they didn't know was that Mike had uncovered secrets buried in decades-old documents that would change everything. Mike didn't sleep for 3 days after returning from California. Every time he looked out his kitchen window at those stumps, rage and grief hit him in equal measure. But his 30 years as a city planner had taught him that emotion without strategy was useless. If he was going to fight back, he needed facts, documentation, and a plan that Brad couldn't wriggle out of. His first stop was the county assessor's office, where he pulled every property record, survey, and development document related to Willowbrook estates dating back to 1960. What he discovered in those dusty files made his pulse quicken with possibility. The original Willowbrook development had been carved out of several large parcels, including Mike's grandfather's farm. When the developers created the subdivision in the early 2000s, they'd made a critical error in the property boundaries. Mike's lot, the original farmhouse property, was actually 12 acres, not the 2 acres he'd always believed. The surveys revealed that what everyone thought was Brad Morrison's backyard was actually a 10-acre section of Mike's land. Somehow, during the subdivision process, a clerical error had resulted in Mike's family receiving a deed for only the homestead portion, while the back 10 acres were never properly transferred to the development company. Legally, Mike owned the land that 6 houses, including Brad's mansion, were built on, but that wasn't the most interesting discovery. Mike found a 1978 environmental easement document that designated the entire back portion of his property as protected watershed land. The easement required that this area remain undeveloped in perpetuity, with public access guaranteed for environmental education and recreation. The county had paid Mike's grandfather $12,000 for this easement, money that had helped send Mike's father to college, according to the legal documents. When the Willowbrook development was approved, the County Planning Commission had assumed this easement was still in effect. They'd approved the subdivision under the mistaken belief that the protected watershed area would remain as community green space. Instead, the development company had built 6 luxury homes directly on protected land. Mike's attorney, Patricia Wong, reviewed the documents with barely concealed excitement. "Mike, this is unprecedented. You not only own the land these houses are built on, but there's a valid environmental easement that makes their construction illegal. The county could be forced to restore the entire area to its natural state. What does that mean for the homeowners? Legally, they're trespassers on your property, but more importantly, their houses were built in violation of environmental law. The county will have to decide between expensive legal battles or enforcing the easement." Mike spent the next week gathering more evidence. He contacted the original environmental group that had pushed for the watershed protection, finding retired activists who remembered the 1978 agreement. He tracked down the surveyor who'd made the boundary error, now in his 80s but willing to provide a sworn statement about the mistake. The breakthrough came when Mike discovered that Morton's Tree Service had never obtained the required permits for removing heritage trees. Even with HOA authorization, county law required environmental review before cutting protected trees. Brad's emergency removal claim was completely fabricated. Mike had the weather reports proving no storms or dangerous conditions existed during his vacation. Patricia assembled a legal strategy that would hit Brad and the HOA from multiple angles: trespassing, environmental violations, destruction of protected trees, fraud in the tree removal authorization, and violation of the watershed easement. But Mike had a different idea brewing, one that would be far more satisfying than any lawsuit. What if we enforced the environmental easement exactly as written? Mike asked Patricia during their final meeting. She looked up from her notes, intrigued. You mean restore the watershed area? I mean turn it into the public park it was supposed to be all along. According to this easement, I'm required to allow public access for environmental education. I've been negligent in my duties as the property owner. Patricia's eyes widened as she understood the implications. Mike, you could literally turn their backyards into a public park. Hiking trails, picnic areas, educational signs about local wildlife, and there's nothing they can do about it. Mike finished. The easement was recorded before their houses were built. They bought their properties subject to my rights. The more Mike thought about it, the more perfect the plan became. Brad had destroyed Mike's private sanctuary to create more sunlight for his own backyard. Now Mike was going to turn that backyard into a public gathering place where dozens of families could enjoy the space every weekend. Mike walked home that evening with a spring in his step. For the first time since the trees were cut down, Brad Morrison had wanted to control the neighborhood's landscaping so badly that he destroyed irreplaceable heritage trees. Now Mike was going to show him what real landscaping looked like, the kind that came with dozens of visitors every weekend. At first, it seemed like a small issue, but Mike was about to unleash something that would change Willowbrook Estates forever. Mike chose his timing carefully. He waited until the Saturday morning when Brad was hosting his monthly HOA board meeting in his backyard, complete with mimosas and self-congratulatory toasts about community improvement initiatives. Mike could see the gathering from his kitchen window, 5 board members and their spouses, all admiring Brad's pristine lawn and newly unobstructed pool area. At exactly 10 a.m., Mike walked out his front door carrying a clipboard, measuring tape, and wearing the same official-looking vest he'd used during his city planning days. Behind him, but Mike's masterstroke was the parking area. Since the park required public access, he worked with the county to establish designated parking spaces along Willowbrook's main street. On weekends, families would arrive for nature walks, children's birthday parties, and environmental education programs that Mike partnered with the local elementary school to provide. Came Patricia Wong and County Surveyor Jim Rodriguez, along with 2 assistants carrying surveying equipment and orange spray paint. Mike had invited the entire Willowbrook community to witness what he'd advertised as important property boundary clarification. About 20 neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, including several who'd grown tired of Brad's increasingly authoritarian HOA leadership. Good morning, everyone, Mike announced loudly enough for Brad's patio gathering to hear. Today, we're conducting an official boundary survey to correct some long-standing property line errors. Brad appeared at his back gate, mimosa in hand and irritation on his face. Mike, what's this about? You can't just bring surveyors onto private property without notice. Actually, Brad, I'm surveying my property. All of it. Jim Rodriguez began setting up his equipment while his assistants started measuring distances from Mike's house toward Brad's backyard. The HOA board members wandered over, curious about the commotion but still confident in their authority. According to the original 1878 land grant and subsequent surveys, Patricia announced to the growing crowd, Mr. Chen's property extends significantly beyond what current residents believe to be the boundaries. The surveyor's assistant began spray painting orange X marks across Brad's prize-winning lawn, following coordinates that Jim called out from his instruments. Each mark fell further into what everyone had assumed was Brad's private backyard. "This is ridiculous," Brad sputtered, setting down his drink. "Mike owns 2 acres. Everyone knows that. I have the development plat right here in my files." "Actually," Mike replied calmly, "I own 12 acres. Always have. My family just never needed to use all of it until now." The orange spray paint trail led straight through Brad's outdoor kitchen, around his pool, and across the manicured gardens of 3 other HOA board members. Neighbors began pulling out their phones to record as the surveyor marked trees, patios, and even portions of houses that sat on Mike's land. Brad's face was turning red as he watched decades of landscaping investment get marked with orange paint. "There has to be a mistake. We bought these properties fair and square. We have insurance. Title companies verified everything." Jim Rodriguez held up his final measurements. "Sir, according to these coordinates and the original land grants, your property line extends to that fence post there." He pointed to a spot 60 feet behind the last row of houses. "Everything between your house and that point belongs to Mr. Chen." The silence was deafening. Brad's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he realized what this meant. His fellow board members stood frozen, mimosas forgotten, as they processed that their backyards, their pools, their gardens, their outdoor investments weren't actually theirs. "But that's impossible," whispered Linda Chen, another board member whose gazebo was now clearly marked with orange paint. "We bought these houses. We have deeds, title, insurance. How could 6 different title companies all make the same mistake?" Patricia stepped forward with her briefcase full of documents. "You have deeds for houses built on Mr. Chen's land without his permission. The original development company made a clerical error in the subdivision process. They sold land they didn't own, and somehow that error was never caught by title companies or county officials." Mike could see neighbors doing quick mental math, calculating how much of their property investments were suddenly in legal jeopardy. The newer residents looked panicked. The longtime residents who remembered when this was all farmland looked less surprised. "Which brings us to our next announcement," Patricia continued. Savoring the moment almost as much as Mike was, Mike smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'm planning some landscaping improvements to my property. Improvements that I think the whole community will enjoy." He pulled out his own folder of documents, county permits already approved and ready for implementation. "You see, it turns out there's an environmental easement on this land dating back to 1978. My grandfather was paid by the county to keep this area undeveloped for watershed protection. The easement requires public access for environmental education and recreation." Brad's mimosa glass slipped from his hand and shattered on his patio. "Public access? What does that mean?" "It means," Mike said with satisfaction, "that I'm legally required to turn this area into a public park. And construction starts Monday morning." The real show was just beginning, and Brad had no idea what was coming next. Mike had learned from Brad's mistake. He wasn't going to act in secret or without proper documentation. The following Monday, he filed all required permits with the county for establishing a public recreational area on his property, complete with environmental restoration plans and public access requirements. The county planning department, still embarrassed by the original boundary error and environmental easement oversight, fast-tracked Mike's permits. Within 2 weeks, he had official approval for Chen Community Park, a watershed education and recreation area. The plan Mike submitted was comprehensive and perfectly legal. The 10-acre section behind the Willowbrook houses would be restored to its original wetland state, complete with native plant restoration, educational walking trails, and public picnic areas. The environmental easement not only allowed this development, it required it. Construction began on a Thursday morning with the arrival of 3 trucks full of workers, plus a county environmental specialist to oversee the restoration project. Mike had hired the same landscaping company that maintained the city's award-winning Riverfront Park. and they brought industrial-grade equipment. Brad was the first to storm over as workers began installing trail markers just 20 feet from his pool deck. "You can't do this. This is harassment. I'm calling the police." Mike was ready with his permits, legal documents, and a county official to back him up. "Brad, I'm simply exercising my property rights and fulfilling my legal obligations under the environmental easement. The county requires me to provide public access to this protected watershed area." The county specialist, Maria Santos, confirmed that everything was proceeding according to approved plans. "Mr. Morrison, these houses were built without proper environmental review. Mr. Chen is actually helping resolve a long-standing code violation by restoring this area to its protected status within days." The transformation was remarkable. Workers removed non-native grass and ornamental plants, replacing them with indigenous wildflowers, native grasses, and young oak trees, Mike's tribute to the heritage trees Brad had destroyed. They built winding gravel paths that meandered between houses, complete with educational signs about local wildlife and watershed protection. The crowning touch was the picnic area Mike positioned directly behind Brad's outdoor kitchen. 6 wooden tables with built-in benches, a charcoal grill, and a bulletin board for posting park rules and community events. Mike even installed solar-powered lights so the area could be used for evening gatherings. The first Saturday after the park opened, over 50 visitors came to explore the new trails. Children played on the wooden playground equipment Mike had installed, while parents relaxed at picnic tables overlooking Brad's backyard pool. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Brad had cut down Mike's trees to eliminate shade over his patio, only to end up with dozens of strangers having picnics 20 feet away. HOA board member Linda Chen tried to organize resistance, claiming the park violated neighborhood covenants about residential tranquility, but Patricia Wong had anticipated this challenge. The environmental easement predated the HOA by 25 years. Making it legally superior to any neighborhood restrictions. The other homeowners whose properties were affected, the Johnsons, the Patels, and the Reeds, initially joined Brad's outrage. But as weeks passed, several began to appreciate having a professionally maintained park in their backyards. The Reed family's teenage daughter started volunteering as a park guide for school credit. The Patels discovered that property values in neighborhoods with adjacent parkland typically increased rather than decreased. Brad, however, grew increasingly desperate. He hired a lawyer to challenge the environmental easement, filed complaints with the county about noise and parking, and even tried to build a privacy fence along what he thought was his property line, only to be stopped when Mike pointed out that fence construction on parkland required environmental impact. Studies. The weekly HOA meetings became contentious affairs, with longtime residents questioning Brad's leadership and the newer residents demanding answers about why no one had discovered the boundary issues before building their homes. Several board members resigned, and rumors spread that multiple homeowners were considering legal action against the original developers. Every morning, Mike watched from his kitchen window as joggers used the park trails. Dog walkers stopped at the waste stations he'd installed, and families set up picnics where Brad's perfectly manicured lawn used to be. The park was everything Mike had envisioned, a living memorial to his destroyed oak trees and a testament to the power of knowing your rights. But then things got even better for Mike, and much worse for Brad. The breaking point came during the annual Willowbrook HOA meeting in late September. What should have been a routine discussion of annual dues and landscaping budgets turned into a full-scale revolt against Brad's leadership. Mike arrived early to the community center, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the same satisfied smile he'd worn for weeks. Nearly every Willowbrook resident attended, a record turnout fueled by months of drama and property value concerns. Brad called the meeting to order, clearly hoping to rush through business before anyone could challenge his authority. First item on the agenda is the ongoing property dispute with Mr. Chen. I've consulted with our attorney about options for challenging the environmental easement. Longtime resident Margaret Foster, whose property wasn't affected by Mike's land claim, stood up immediately. Brad, before you spend more of our money on lawyers, maybe you should explain how this happened in the first place. What do you mean? How did you authorize cutting down protected heritage trees without permits? How did 6 houses get built on land that wasn't properly owned by the development company? And why didn't anyone on this board know about the environmental easement before now? The room buzzed with agreement. Mike remained silent, letting the community's frustration speak for itself. Brad's face flushed red. Look, these are complex legal issues that occurred before I became HOA president. My focus has been on improving our community standards and property values by destroying century-old trees. Called out Janet, Mike's house sitter who had become a fierce ally. Those trees were worth over $100,000, and you had them cut down illegally while Mike was visiting his family. Young lawyer Tom Patel, whose gazebo now sat next to Mike's park trail, had done his own research into HOA liability. Brad, do you realize that your unauthorized tree removal has exposed this HOA to massive financial liability? Mike could sue us for the value of those trees, plus punitive damages for the fraudulent work order you submitted. The revelation that Morton's Tree Service had been given false information about Mike's consent rippled through the crowd. Several homeowners who had trusted Brad's leadership began asking pointed questions about other decisions he'd made without board approval. Then Mike's attorney, Patricia Wong, stood to address the room. I want to clarify something for everyone here. Mr. Chen has not sued the HOA for the tree removal, and he doesn't plan to. However, he does have some announcements about his plans for Chen Community Park. Mike rose slowly, savoring the moment. Thank you, Patricia. I wanted to let everyone know that the county has approved Phase 2 of the park development. He opened his folder and began reading from official documents. Starting next month, we'll be installing additional amenities, including expanded parking for up to 40 vehicles, restroom facilities, and a covered pavilion for larger community events. The County Parks and Recreation Department will also be scheduling regular programming, including summer day camps and weekend nature festivals. The silence was deafening. Brad's supporters looked stricken as they realized that Mike's Park wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was becoming a permanent, expanding public attraction in their backyards. But here's the really exciting news, Mike continued, barely able to contain his satisfaction. The environmental restoration has been so successful that the State Wildlife Agency wants to designate the area as an official bird sanctuary. That designation comes with additional protections and increased public programming. Linda Chen raised a shaking hand. Mike, surely we can work out some kind of compromise. What if the HOA paid for replacement trees on your actual property? Mike shook his head. Linda, you can't replace 100-year-old heritage trees. But more importantly, I've discovered something wonderful about having a public park. Do you know how much the city would charge me in property taxes for 12 acres of prime real estate, but parkland designated for public use and environmental protection? That's tax exempt. The financial implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. Mike was saving thousands of dollars annually in property taxes while his neighbors dealt with decreased privacy and increased traffic. Brad made one final, desperate attempt to maintain control. This is still a HOA matter. We can vote to challenge the easement and force Mike to... Actually, Brad, interrupted Tom Patel, I think we need to vote on new HOA leadership. I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current board. The motion was seconded immediately. Within an hour, Brad Morrison and his entire board had been voted out of office, replaced by residents who wanted to focus on damage control rather than expensive legal battles they couldn't win. As the meeting ended, Mike packed up his documents and headed home. Through his kitchen window, he could see families enjoying evening picnics in the park, children playing where Brad's perfect lawn used to be. The war was over, and Mike had won completely. But what happened next surprised everyone. 6 months later, Mike sits on his front porch every morning, watching families head to Chen Community Park for their daily walks. The native oak saplings he planted are thriving, and the bird sanctuary designation brought species back to the area that hadn't been seen in decades. Brad Morrison's house went up for sale 3 months after the HOA meeting. The realtor's listing mentioned adjacent to community parkland as a selling point, though the asking price reflected the reality of having 40 weekend visitors picnicking in your backyard. The new owners, a young family with environmental science backgrounds, actually volunteered to help with park maintenance. The lesson Mike learned wasn't about revenge. It was about the power of patience, research, and knowing your rights. Brad's arrogance and rush to control his neighbor had backfired spectacularly because he never bothered to understand what he was really dealing with. Asterisk, have you ever faced HOA bullying or neighborhood power trips? Asterisk, share your story in the comments. You might be surprised what rights you actually have. And if you enjoyed seeing justice served with a side of environmental restoration, hit that subscribe button. Next week, we're diving into the story of a Karen who tried to ban a veteran service dog from the community pool until she learned about federal disability law. Trust me, you won't want to miss that meltdown.